It came out of the sun, silent, blinding, almost invisible. By the time you saw it, it was already too late. In the first years of the Pacific War, Allied pilots whispered its name with dread: Zero. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and strike harder than anything they had ever faced. It was Japan's sword in the sky, beautiful, deadly, and unstoppable. This is the story of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the ghost that haunted the Pacific. In the late 1930s, Japan stood on the edge of empire. Its forces had swept through China and the Pacific Islands, but the Imperial Japanese Navy wanted more than dominance at sea. It wanted control of the air. The Navy's requirement was simple and impossible: a fighter that could outfly everything, outclimb anything, and travel farther than any other. When engineers at Mitsubishi read the request, most said it couldn't be done. All except one man, Jiro Horikoshi. Horikoshi was young, brilliant, and obsessed with efficiency. He believed in lightness, the art of removing everything that wasn't necessary. His philosophy would shape the aircraft that would terrify the world. He designed a plane with elegant, tapered wings that flowed like a swallow in flight. Every rivet, every line, every panel was placed with purpose. He used aluminum alloys so light they could bend by hand. The aircraft carried two 20mm cannons, two 7.7mm machine guns, and a heart, the Nakajima Sake radial engine, capable of pushing it to nearly 350 miles per hour. When the prototype took off in 1939, test pilots were stunned. It could climb to 10,000 feet in just over 3 minutes. It turned so tightly that nothing in the world could match it. And its range, over 1,500 miles, was unheard of for a fighter. Japan had created something extraordinary: a long-range carrier-based fighter that fought like a racer and flew like a ghost. The world met the Zero on December 7, 1941. As Japanese planes screamed down on Pearl Harbor, Zeeks, the Allied code name for the A6M Zero, swarmed the skies. They shredded American P-40 and P-36s in seconds. In the months that followed, they destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft across the Pacific, over the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. American pilots were stunned. They couldn't outturn it. They couldn't outclimb it. Every time they dove to escape, the Zero followed. To many it seemed supernatural, a ghost that could appear anywhere, strike, and vanish. By 1942, the Zero ruled the Pacific. In the hands of elite Japanese pilots, men trained to perfection and taught that death in combat was honor, it seemed unbeatable. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, and again at Midway, it dominated the dogfights above the ocean. But then the tide began to turn. In June 1942, at Midway, Japan lost 4 of its best carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. The Zero remained deadly, but the men who had mastered it were gone. Younger, less trained replacements took their place. And across the Pacific, American engineers were studying something new. In the summer of 1942, a nearly intact Zero crashed on Akutan Island, Alaska. The Americans recovered it. For the first time, they could test its strengths and its weaknesses. They discovered its secret. The Zero's brilliance came at a terrible cost. To make it so light, Horikoshi had stripped away armor. The cockpit had no protection. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. One burst of gunfire could turn the Ghost into a fireball. The myth was over. The Americans changed their tactics. They stopped turning with the Zero and started diving past it. The new F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair were faster, tougher, and better armed. By 1943, the hunter had become the hunted. In the skies over the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and the Marianas, the Zero still fought fiercely. But its time was ending. Its engine couldn't match the power of new Allied fighters. Its range, once unmatched, now mattered less as the US Navy moved ever closer to Japan's shores. Still, the pilots flew. They fought with courage, with pride, and finally, with desperation. By 1944, the Empire turned to suicide missions, kamikaze attacks. Many of the last Zeros were used not as fighters, but as flying bombs. They carried the same spirit they had always had: discipline, sacrifice, and resolve. But their purpose had changed forever. The Zero had become a symbol not of dominance, but of tragedy. When the war ended in 1945, the skies over the Pacific were quiet again. Thousands of Zeros lay shattered on airfields across Asia. The ghosts were gone. Jiro Horikoshi survived the war. He lived to see Japan rebuild and rise again. When asked about his creation, he said quietly, "All I wanted to do was make something beautiful." He did. The Zero was beautiful. And like all beautiful things born in war, its brilliance came with a shadow. Today, when one of the few surviving Zeros takes to the sky, its engine still hums with that haunting tone, soft, smooth, and strangely alive. People look up and remember. Not the Empire, not the war, but the men who flew it, and the impossible dream of perfection that built it. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not just a fighter. It was Japan's ghost, swift, silent, and unforgettable.
June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. From the decks of the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, 220 blue-painted aircraft thundered into the morning sky. Their engines roared like anger given wings. The men who flew them had a simple mission: hunt the ghost of the Pacific. At 10,000 feet, Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu of VF-16 scanned the distant horizon. Tiny silver shapes were rising from the Japanese fleet. Zeros, hundreds of them, climbing toward the American strike groups. Vratsiu grinned through his oxygen mask. "This time," he muttered, "we're not the underdogs anymore." The aircraft beneath him was unlike anything Japan had faced before, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine born out of defeat and engineered for revenge. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Grumman's Long Island plant in December 1941, Design Chief Leroy Grumman was already sketching an evolution of his rugged F4F Wildcat. But the reports from the Pacific changed everything. The Mitsubishi Zero had outflown and outclimbed everything America had. To survive, the next generation fighter needed to be faster, deadlier, and tougher than anything in the sky. Grumman's engineers called it Project G50. Pilots would soon call it the Hellcat. Built not for elegance but for dominance, it was a flying hammer forged from the lessons of early defeat. The first prototype, F6F-1, rolled out in June 1942, powered by the Wright R2600 Cyclone engine. It was good, but not great. Then in July, fate delivered a gift. On a remote island in the Aleutians, American engineers recovered a nearly intact Zero, the Akutan Zero, after its pilot had crash-landed. The captured aircraft was tested in secret at San Diego. The results stunned engineers. The Zero was fast but fragile, agile but unarmored. It could outturn anything, but it couldn't take a hit. Grumman's team went back to the drawing board. The Cyclone engine was ripped out, replaced by the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same engine that powered the Thunderbolt. They strengthened the frame, added armor plating around the cockpit, and installed self-sealing fuel tanks. The Hellcat would not dance like the Zero. It would smash it. By August 1943, the first squadrons of F6F-3 Hellcats arrived in the Pacific. Pilots who'd survived the early battles in Wildcats immediately noticed the difference. The Hellcat could climb faster, dive harder, and take punishment that would shred a Zero in seconds. And unlike earlier fighters, it gave rookies a chance to live long enough to learn. Commander David McCampbell, who would become America's top Navy ace with 34 victories, described the aircraft simply. You could hit anything, climb away, and come back to finish the job.
The Hellcat's baptism of fire came over Marcus Island in September 1943. Japanese observers initially mistook them for Wildcats until they saw the speed and the climbing power. Within 15 minutes, 20 Zeros had fallen, for the loss of just 2 Hellcats. The message was clear. The era of the Zero was ending. By mid-1944, the Hellcat was everywhere, from Tarawa to Truk, Saipan to the Marianas. It became the Navy's primary fighter, escorting bombers, hunting Zeros, and sweeping the skies clean before amphibious landings. It was rugged enough to absorb direct hits, heavy enough to crush opponents in a dive, and simple enough to repair overnight on a pitching carrier deck. A Marine pilot joked, "The Hellcat's like a barroom brawler, not fancy, but if it hits you, you stay down." Then came June 19th, 1944, the day that would enter history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. When nearly 400 Japanese aircraft rose from the fleet to stop the American invasion of Saipan, 273 Hellcats were waiting. Radar picked them up 70 miles out. By the time the sky cleared, over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most by Hellcats. The US Navy lost 29. In a single day, the balance of air power in the Pacific shifted forever. By war's end, the numbers told a story of staggering dominance. The F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. Its kill-to-loss ratio? 19-1. Even the once invincible Zero had become prey. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the few survivors, later admitted, "The Hellcat was a monster. Against it, we could only die bravely."